Why did Jews and Arabs become enemies? Many people would answer without giving it much thought. Because it has always been that way. Because their religions are incompatible. Because this land is supposedly condemned to eternal war. But this is where the first lie begins. Not one people's lie about another. The lie of a convenient formula. It frees us from the need to understand. It allows someone to look at an old photograph of Jerusalem, a crowded street in Jaffa, a market in Haifa, at stone houses, mosques, synagogues and churches, and say, "They have hated each other since the beginning of time." History tells a different story. One land, two national memories, two peoples who look at the same cities, roads, houses, fields and graves and say the same words. This is our home. The most frightening thing about this conflict is not that people remember nothing. The most frightening thing is that each side remembers too much, but remembers above all its own pain. Today, the goal is not to declare one people eternally guilty. The goal is to understand how a neighbor becomes a threat, how the salvation of one people begins to look to another like the beginning of its disappearance, and why a conflict that did not originate in deep antiquity came to seem eternal. Before we begin peeling away the layers of this dangerous myth, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Not for the sake of the algorithm, but for the sake of stories in which complexity matters more than slogans, and memory is stronger than propaganda. Let us begin with the most uncomfortable fact. Even the expression Jews and Arabs can be misleading. The Jews are a people connected by a shared historical, cultural, and religious memory, but they are also enormously diverse. Arabs are a broad linguistic and cultural community that includes Muslims, Christians, and people of many other beliefs. There were, and still are, Jews whose native language was Arabic. In Baghdad, Cairo, Aleppo, Fez, Tunis, and many other cities, Jewish families lived for centuries within the Arabic-speaking world. This was not a fairy tale of perfect harmony. In Muslim states, Jews often held the status of a protected but subordinate minority. There were special taxes, legal restrictions, humiliations, and periods of violence. But there was also trade, neighborly coexistence, a shared urban culture, intellectual exchange, Arabic language Jewish literature, and entire eras in which Jewish thought developed in Arabic. In medieval Spain, Baghdad, and North Africa, Jewish scholars read Arabic books, translated works on medicine and philosophy, debated Muslim intellectuals, and created their own works within a shared cultural world. This was the complicated life of a minority, not an unbroken war between two races. The myth of an ancient natural hatred therefore collapses immediately. Tensions existed. Discrimination existed, outbursts of violence existed. But the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict cannot be traced back to a single ancient religious text. Its principal political forms emerged much later, in the age of nationalism, empires, and mass politics. And another clarification is necessary here. The modern conflict is not simply a dispute between Judaism and Islam. It began as a confrontation between two national movements claiming a political future on the same territory. Religion intensified the significance of the land, and especially Jerusalem, but the conflict was also driven by power, demography, migration, property, borders, and the right to self-determination. To understand the Jewish side, we must travel in our minds not to a Middle Eastern desert, but to a European city at the end of the 19th century. On a wall, there is a notice forbidding Jews from settling in a particular area. In a newspaper, there is an accusation of dual loyalty. In the street, there is a mob. In the Russian Empire, there are pogroms. In France, there is the case of the officer Alfred Dreyfus, convicted on false charges of treason, while his Jewish origin is turned into a symbol of suspicion. In Central and Eastern Europe, a Jew could be educated, speak the language of the country, serve that country, and still be told that he was a foreigner. Zionism did not arise from one cause or in a single day. It combined the ancient Jewish connection to the land of Israel, the European age of national movements, and an increasingly bitter conviction. Assimilation did not guarantee safety. Theodor Herzl, a journalist from Vienna, published The Jewish State in 1896. The following year, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel. But there was no unity among Jews. Some supported political Zionism. Others believed Jewish life should be built in the diaspora. Religious opponents challenged the very idea of a secular Jewish state. Socialists proposed fighting for equality in the countries where Jews already lived. It would therefore be wrong to say, the Jews decided to move there and take the land. Millions of Jews played no part in this project at all. But another fact cannot be denied. The Zionist movement sought to create a Jewish national home in Palestine, and later a Jewish state. To its supporters, this represented a return to the historic homeland and an attempt to escape perpetual dependence on the power of others. The first waves of Jewish immigration to Ottoman Palestine began before the First World War. Land was often purchased legally from its owners, including large landowners who lived far from the villages themselves. But a legal purchase did not erase its human consequences. Arab tenant farmers might have worked that land for generations. When an owner sold a plot, the new purchaser saw a legal document and the beginning of a settlement. The family that had cultivated the field saw the loss of the life it had always known. Here we find the first tragic divide in perception. To a Jewish settler, a piece of land could mean safety, labor, and return. To a local Arab farmer, the same land could mean that someone was building a future in which he had no place. Palestine under the Ottoman Empire was not an empty land. Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, Jewish communities, and other groups lived there. There were cities, villages, family networks, landowners, craftsmen, merchants, and peasants. Palestinian Arab identity developed gradually within a broader Arab and Ottoman reality. But local attachment to towns, villages, and land was real long before the creation of the State of Israel. This is why the phrase, "a land without a people, for a people without a land," often associated with Zionist propaganda, was not a description of reality, but a political image. The Jews truly did not possess a sovereign state, but the land was not uninhabited. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine came under British administration. On November 2, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild. The British government declared that it viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. At the same time, the document promised that nothing would be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. Pay attention to the language. The majority of the population was not described as a people possessing political rights. They appeared in the document merely as non-Jewish communities. For the Zionist movement, this was historic recognition from a great power. For the Palestinian Arabs, it was an imperial declaration about the future of their country, made without their consent. Britain did not create every contradiction from nothing, but it embedded those contradictions into a system of government. The League of Nations mandate formally supported the establishment of a Jewish national home. At the same time, the British were expected to govern a territory where the Arab majority was demanding independence. London attempted to preserve its empire, fulfill its international obligations, contain the violence, and avoid losing the support of either side. It became less and less capable of doing any of these things. Jewish immigration increased, especially after the Nazis came to power in Germany. For the Jews of Europe, closing borders were a matter of life and death. For the Arab population of Palestine, the growth of the Yishuv, the organized Jewish community with its own schools, trade unions, medical system, economy, and armed organizations, looked like the creation of a future state inside their country. At the end of 1946, according to estimates by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, approximately 1,203,000 Arabs, around 608,000 Jews, and roughly 35,000 people belonging to other groups lived in Palestine. Jews made up approximately one-third of the population, but their proportion had increased rapidly since the beginning of British rule. These were not merely statistics. Imagine how the two sides read those numbers. A Jew saw hundreds of thousands of people who, in a single generation, had built cities, kibbutzim, a university, hospitals, and a system of self-government capable of receiving the persecuted. A Palestinian Arab saw a politically organized minority, supported by an international movement, moving closer to receiving a state, while the majority was denied its promised independence. When does the salvation of one people begin to look like a threat to another? Right here. In 1936, a major Arab revolt began against British rule, Jewish immigration, and land sales. It continued until 1939. The revolt included strikes, attacks, and armed resistance. The British suppressed it through military force, arrests, executions, house demolitions, and reliance on auxiliary formations. Jewish civilians were also killed in attacks. In response, Jewish defense organizations grew stronger, while radical underground groups increasingly turned to retaliation and terrorism. Violence changed more than the map. It changed the way people saw their neighbors. After an attack, it becomes harder to see the person on the other side as an ordinary merchant, teacher, or farmer. After a funeral, it becomes easier to believe that an entire community wants you dead. After a retaliatory strike, fear receives fresh evidence. Collective categories begin to replace individual human beings. In 1939, Britain issued the White Paper, restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine. This happened at the very moment when European Jews were desperately searching for refuge. During the Holocaust, millions of Jews were murdered, while the doors of many countries remained closed. After the war, survivors remained in displaced persons camps. Many did not want or were unable to return to places where their families had been murdered, their homes had been looted, and antisemitism had not disappeared. The story of the ship Exodus became a symbol of this desperation. In July 1947, more than 4,500 Jewish refugees attempted to reach Palestine. British forces intercepted the vessel, removed the passengers in Haifa, and ultimately sent them back to camps in Germany. To the world, the image was almost unbearable. People who had survived Nazi Europe found themselves behind barbed wire once again. After the Holocaust, the idea of a Jewish state ceased to be a theoretical project for many Jews. It became an answer to a question that Europe had resolved in the most horrifying way possible. Who would protect the Jews when the state itself became the murderer and other states closed their borders? But a Palestinian Arab could ask a different question. Why should Europe's crime be paid for through the loss of our political future? Both questions were real, and they collided on the same land. In February 1947, Britain referred the Palestine question to the United Nations. A special committee considered several possible solutions. The majority of its members proposed dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states linked by an economic union, while Jerusalem would become a separate international zone. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. It was a recommendation for partition, not a peace agreement already accepted by both sides. Zionist leadership accepted the plan, although there were disagreements within Jewish society over the borders and the future of Jerusalem. The Palestinian Arab leadership and the Arab states rejected it. They considered it unjust that a country with an Arab majority should be divided, and that a substantial territory should be granted to a state representing a Jewish population, much of which had arrived during the previous few decades. From the Jewish perspective, partition was a painful but internationally recognized opportunity for sovereignty after centuries of powerlessness and the recent murder of 6 million European Jews. We have reached the middle of this story. And if you already feel that the familiar formula, "they have always hated each other," can no longer survive contact with the facts, write in the comments what has surprised you most. Leave a like and subscribe. The most painful layer still lies ahead. The moment when the same year received two completely different names. From the perspective of the Palestinian Arabs, an international organization was deciding the fate of their homeland without the consent of the majority of its inhabitants. This history cannot be told honestly in a single sentence. After the vote, a civil war began between Jewish and Arab forces inside Mandatory Palestine. Roads were blocked, convoys were ambushed, urban neighborhoods became front lines. Deir Yassin, where fighters from the Irgun and Lehi killed many Arab inhabitants in April 1948, became a Palestinian symbol of horror. The attack on a Jewish medical convoy traveling to Hadassah Hospital became, for Jews, proof that the war would not spare even doctors and patients. One crime cannot be used to erase another. Civilians cannot be reduced to footnotes in a national project. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. The following day, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq entered the war. For the Jewish population, this was a war for the survival of the newly declared state. The fear of defeat was not imaginary. The memory of the Holocaust was still fresh, the population was small, and the institutions of the state were only beginning to take shape. For the Palestinians, the war became the Nakba, the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or lost their homes. The causes differed from place to place: flight from fighting and fear, the collapse of local administration, and, in some areas, direct expulsions. The claim that everyone left in response to a single order from Arab authorities does not explain what happened. But it would also be an oversimplification to reduce every incident to one identical, centrally planned policy implemented in the same way everywhere. Historians continue to debate the intentions of the leadership and the extent of deliberate policy. The outcome, however, is beyond dispute. Hundreds of thousands became refugees, and many villages were emptied or destroyed. The same year entered two national memories under different names. For Israeli Jews, it was the War of Independence, the birth of a state intended to guarantee that a Jew would never again be forced to beg a foreign consul to open a border. For the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the loss of a home, a village, an orchard, a quay, a cemetery, and the belief that they would return within a few weeks. In old photographs, refugees carry bundles and keys, hoping to return. On the other side of the front, Jewish families sit in shelters, terrified that defeat will mean another catastrophe. The war ended with armistice agreements in 1949. Israel controlled more territory than the partition plan had allocated to it. The West Bank came under Jordanian control, while the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian control. The Palestinian Arab state, envisioned by the resolution, did not come into existence. In the Arab countries, defeat was experienced as humiliation and injustice. Palestinian refugees lived in camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Their legal status and living conditions varied, but the questions of return, compensation, and the lost home did not disappear. At the same time, Jewish communities in Arab and Muslim countries came under increasing pressure. In some places, there were repression and confiscations. Elsewhere, fear and public hostility intensified. In other cases, Zionist organizations encouraged departure. Hundreds of thousands of Jews left Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and other countries. Many settled in Israel. These departures had different causes, but they became part of the same great rupture. The conflict tore apart the ancient Jewish communities of the Arabic-speaking world. People whose families had spoken Arabic for centuries and lived alongside Muslims and Christians suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a new political frontier. In 1967, the Six-Day War took place. Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For Israel, the victory brought relief from the fear of encirclement. For the Palestinians, it marked the beginning of a new reality of military control, while hundreds of thousands were once again displaced or forced to flee. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 linked future peace to a territorial settlement and the right of states to live within secure boundaries. But its interpretation and implementation became the subject of disputes lasting for decades. After 1967, the word occupation became central to Palestinian memory, while the word security became central to Israeli memory. A Palestinian saw a military checkpoint, movement permits, arrests, land confiscation, and expanding Israeli settlements. An Israeli saw attacks by armed groups, aircraft hijackings, cross-border infiltrations, bombings, and statements from those who denied Israel's very right to exist. Explaining fear does not mean justifying violence. A terrorist attack against civilians remains a crime, even when committed by someone who grew up under occupation. Expulsion, collective punishment, and the killing of civilians do not become acceptable simply because a state speaks in the language of security. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a war in an attempt to recover the territories they had lost 6 years earlier. In Israel, the surprise attack on Yom Kippur deepened the sense of vulnerability. But the war eventually opened a path to diplomacy. Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty in 1979, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Former enemies made a different political choice. In 1987, the First Intifada began, a mass Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. Strikes, demonstrations, boycotts, clashes, and violence were met by harsh military and police measures. The Palestinians were increasingly recognized as a distinct people, demanding a state of their own. In 1993, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization formally recognized each other. The Palestinian organization recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security and renounced terrorism as a method. Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The Declaration of Principles provided for Palestinian self-government, while postponing the questions of borders, Jerusalem, settlements, security, and refugees until future negotiations. Why then did peace not come? Because the most difficult questions were postponed. Because trust was too weak, and the enemies of compromise were too determined. In November 1995, the Israeli extremist Yigal Amir assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, believing the agreements to be an act of betrayal. Palestinian terrorist organizations carried out bombings against Israeli civilians. These attacks destroyed the belief that concessions would bring security. For Palestinians, the continued construction of settlements appeared to prove that negotiations were taking place while the territory of their future state was being fragmented. In Resolution 2334, the United Nations Security Council reaffirmed its position that the settlements established in Palestinian territory occupied since 1967 have no legal validity and obstruct a two-state solution. Israel disputes a number of legal and historical interpretations concerning the status of the territories and emphasizes its security requirements. By the end of the 1990s, each side believed that its worst fears had been confirmed. An Israeli said, "We recognized them, and received terrorism in return." A Palestinian replied, "We recognized Israel, but we still did not receive a state." These are not two complete and final truths. They are two political memories that once again became sealed inside their own pain. Jerusalem made the knot even tighter. For Jews, it is the city of the temple, and the center of thousands of years of memory. For Muslims, it is the city of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Palestinians regard East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state, while Israel declares the United City to be its capital. Here, faith, archaeology, sovereignty, and everyday life are layered on top of one another. The refugees form another knot. The Palestinian family preserves the key to a lost home and considers return a matter of justice. The Israeli side views a large-scale return of the refugees' descendants as a threat to the Jewish majority and to the very meaning of a Jewish state. Security is the third knot. Israel was created as a refuge for a people who had survived pogroms and the Holocaust. A threat to the state is therefore perceived as the possibility of returning to complete defenselessness. Self-determination is the fourth knot. The Palestinians experienced the Nakba, life without a sovereign state, and occupation. The absence of statehood is therefore perceived as a continuation of the denial of their right to determine their own future. So why did Jews and Arabs become enemies? Not because Judaism commanded Jews to hate Arabs, not because Islam condemned Arabs to hate Jews, not because the blood of the two peoples is supposedly incompatible. People become enemies in another way. First, one person fears that he will once again be expelled from the country where he was born. Another fears that newcomers, supported by an empire, will turn him into a minority in his own land. One builds a settlement and sees a return. Another looks at the fence and sees displacement. One celebrates independence. Another preserves the key to a lost home. One remembers the armies that promised to destroy the young state. Another remembers the soldiers after whose arrival his family could no longer return. Fear becomes a political program. The political program receives weapons. The weapons create graves. The graves become proof that trust is impossible. Egypt and Israel fought wars and later signed a peace treaty. Jordan and Israel also made peace. Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization were able to recognize each other, even though they failed to reach a final agreement. This means that hostility is not biology and not an eternal law. It is created by decisions, trauma, and violence, and it can therefore be changed by different decisions. This is not a promise of easy reconciliation. Memory cannot be ordered to forget. Israelis cannot be asked to forget pogroms, the Holocaust, wars, and terrorism. Palestinians cannot be asked to forget the Nakba, refugee camps, occupation, and the state that never came into existence. The pain of one side does not invalidate the pain of the other. When memory says, "Only our pain is real," it prepares the next war. When memory says, "Our pain is real, and that is why we must recognize the pain of the other," a possibility emerges for a politics that does not require the disappearance of another people. What must be remembered from this history? The modern hostility did not last for thousands of years. The political conflict, as we know it, was formed mainly during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. Zionism was a response to Jewish statelessness, antisemitism, and the need for safety. But it was implemented on land where an Arab population already lived and possessed its own right to self-determination. The British Mandate brought incompatible promises together and failed to create a fair mechanism for consent. The year 1948 became both the birth of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba. The conflict cannot be understood if either of these realities is erased. The War of 1967, the occupation, terrorism, settlements, refugees, and the failure of the peace process turned mutual fear into an inheritance passed down to new generations. Why did Jews and Arabs become enemies? Not because they were condemned to hate each other, but because in the 20th century, one land became the answer to the fears of two peoples. For the Jews, the fear of once again being left without protection. For the Palestinians, the fear of losing their home, their majority, and their political future. When two fears meet on the same land, history can turn neighbors into enemies. But if this hostility was created by history, it is not an eternal law of nature. And that is the most difficult, the most honest, and perhaps the most important answer. If you watch this episode to the end, write the code phrase, "two memories," in the comments. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. As long as the two memories hear only themselves, the conflict will continue. When history restores a human face to both sides, propaganda has less room to survive.